Kia ora koutou. I'm Sean Davis, an Enterprise Advisor at Venture Taranaki. Next to me is Stephanie Led, our Investment Advisor, and you're joining us for another Ahead of the Curve webinar brought to you by Venture Taranaki. Today we're covering social procurement, a hot topic throughout the country as the public and private sector looks to drive positive outcomes through expenditure. Today we have Dr. Seán Barnes, the Director of Social Procurement at the Ākina Foundation, joining us to cover all aspects of social procurement, the definition, the drivers, the opportunities, and the challenges involved. Before we hear from Seán, there's just a few things. We're in a webinar, so if you could please just look at the functions below. So there's a chat box. This is where you interact with all panelists and attendees. And there's also a Q&A box. So if you could ask all your questions in there, we'll get to them at the end. Over to you now, Seán.
Kia ora, Sean. Thank you. Right, we'll get into things. Just play around with the ina mana, ina reo, ina karanga, maha o te wā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Seán Barnes toku ingoa. Kia ora. As mentioned, I'm Seán Barnes from the Ākina Foundation, and welcome to hear more about social procurement today. My background is in professional engineering, and I always found myself asking the question of what is value? Are we here to build things, or are we about creating value? And particularly, are we leaving opportunities to create value on the table when we do our work? So this has really led to my interest in business as an opportunity to create good, and really social procurement is one of these tools that we have at our disposal right now to see what we can do in terms of that. So first of all, I'll just start with a whakatauki that I believe captures where we're at the moment, and the challenges that we're facing. And it shows that after a bad time, there is always a good time. So that's what we hold in our work. First of all, a little bit about Ākina. We are an impact development organisation that works nationally across Aotearoa, and we work across a number of areas, including impact investment and impact measurement and strategy, and also capability building, and the area that I look after in social procurement advisory and support. So what are we going to cover today? First of all, I'd like to take you through what is social procurement. It's increasingly relevant to both the public and private sector in New Zealand, and also the regional conversations are really important at the moment. So this is a great time to be having this conversation. We'd like to have a look at what this looks like in New Zealand and explore how social procurement works and some of the drivers in practice. But first of all, let's start at the top and start with some definitions and what's going on. First of all, there are a number of changing expectations in our economy. We're seeing changes in behaviour from consumers and the way people buy and what they're looking for. And again, this comes back to that language of value. What value are you providing? Also, equally, investors are looking for different things increasingly, and this is a global trend as well. And we've seen this play out in the likes of KiwiSaver and the types of things that they invest into, and also more recent times, the banks and the conversations that have been had around investment and the outcomes that can be generated through investment. There's changing expectations of employees. Increasingly, people don't want to work for organisations where there's a misalignment of values, or they feel that these values have been compromised in any way. And also, we've seen the changing of the language of government and the move towards thinking about the broader concepts of well-being and those types of things, which start to move beyond purely economic measures of success. So starting at impact, I'll use this word often through the presentation. Impact, we describe at Ākina as meaning positive social, cultural, and environmental outcomes that are a result of an action. So if you think of it, something's done, or there is an action, and then there's a cascade of outcomes that come from that. And really, what we're trying to maximize here is the amount of positive impact that's generated through the activity of procurement. which is what we're talking about today. You can apply the same thing to any other things that you do in terms of your work. Everything will have a consequence, and it's really about what is that from a negative or positive perspective. So social procurement, there's a lot of other terms that are used. So I'll use the term social procurement, but there are also, there's sustainable procurement, which gets used. These things are all interchangeable, and it doesn't really matter, and a lot of it is really predicated by the organisation that you work with and what resonates the most. But there's also progressive procurement. There's a lot of words. The language is a source of a lot of confusion. Social quite often gets packed up as only being social, and environmental gets packed up as sustainable. All these things, but it doesn't really matter. Today, I'll use social procurement. It covers social, cultural, economic, and environmental, any of these positive outcomes. So what is it? If we start with procurement, which is the processes and the way people purchase goods, services, and works through the life cycle of those contracts or items, then social procurement is doing that, but intentionally looking to generate positive social, cultural, environmental, and economic outcomes. So it's really the core part of procurement, but doing it intentionally to create positive outcomes on top of that come alongside the goods or services that you're purchasing. There is an international standard, ISO 2400, which talks about procurement that has the most positive environmental, social, and economic impacts possible over the entire life cycle. So you can see how aspirational it is. But I always like to draw attention to the word intentional, because you can accidentally do social procurement, but it's a lot more beneficial, and you actually know what happens when you're intentional with it. So the other way to think about it, and for those who are existing inside organisations, especially in the likes of local government and government, is that what we're doing here is bringing a cross-functional approach to value. So it's quite often the procurement team has a role sitting inside the organisation, and then you'll have a sustainability person who has a role trying to push along, sustainable outcomes, and then you'll have an HR team who's interested in diversity and employment and pathways. And really, it's about bringing some of these things that are often siloed into the same conversation and seeing where there's opportunities for procurement to deliver the outcomes that, for example, sustainability are trying to generate as well. And when organisations start to look at their supply chains, you realise that you can't actually achieve a lot of the things that you want to achieve without bringing your supply chain along or considering it. The other thing that we work a lot with social enterprises, and I'll use it as an example of an impact-led organisation. I'll come to the other flavours of organisations that you can have as suppliers. But again, just starting with a definition, we define social enterprise as an organisation that has a purpose. That's their primary purpose. That's a social, environmental impact, cultural impact. As I've talked about before, anything really goes, and anything that's not maximising personal or private gain inside an organisation. And the other thing is around social enterprises, they all trade. They are trading entities. They provide products and services that we associate with business. So, and then the third part of the definition is that we look for evidence of reinvestment. So if they exist for the purpose they say they're looking for, and they're successful and they make money, then where does the money go? It goes back into the purpose, and that's the hallmark of a social enterprise. The reality of where social enterprises fit in New Zealand is, if you think of a spectrum of the types of organisations, and we use the term charity to describe the organisations that do good and quite often are looking around for money and funding and donations, etc. And we quite often associate business as maximising commercial gain. It's really, there are organisations that exist all the way along the spectrum, and what we're seeing in New Zealand is increasingly not-for-profits are looking for opportunities to generate their own revenue, and there's a lot of people working in that space. And we're also seeing businesses want to become more impactful, and whether that's the drivers of sustainability or community license to operate or CSR and those types of things. So the responsible businesses, and that both of those aspects are showing organisations migrating towards the middle of the spectrum, and really social enterprise is something that sits in the middle of the spectrum. And you can put hard edges around it, but if you take away the idea that any organization can deliver positive outcomes, whether you identify as a business or a trading not-for-profit, it doesn't really matter. Those are the kinds of entities that we're looking for in social procurement, in the way social procurement's done. So what do social enterprises look like? Just to give you an example, they can take a variety of forms, and this is a really good message for any supplier actually, is once you get to know them and what they're about, you'll find that people do things in lots of different ways. And really what a social enterprise is trying to do is deliver impact and run a viable business at the same time. It's kind of crazy to think about trying to go into that space when it's hard enough to start a business, but a lot of people are really passionate about trying to make a difference. And you'll see this ingrained in so many organizations now. So they're looking for that impact, and the business model is a really good way to understand how they work. I've just got a short video here, and hopefully we'll
We started to work with businesses because businesses have a lot of buying power. The fashion industry as a whole is the second biggest polluter in the world. Businesses are a big driver towards this issue. We thought by teaming up with them, we could make a much bigger difference. We can get businesses behind communities, get businesses behind the environment, help businesses become more responsible in order to create a better world. So initially, we just started working with a few different craftsmen. The goal for us is to work with thousands of craftsmen all around the world, educate their children, contribute towards less equality in this world, find new sustainable materials that are going to empower the environment. Why should we have a bag made out of plastic when we can have a bag made out of pineapple leaves, or a t-shirt made from cotton with lots of chemicals when we can have a t-shirt made from organic materials or bamboo or hemp? The future of Duffel & Co. is not only to empower more and more and more of these special communities around the world that do need a lending hand, it's also to empower the environment by looking into new materials, bridging that gap between design, sustainability, and community.
So you can see a richness there in that kind of enterprise, and that's one of the opportunities that exists in social procurement, is around suppliers like that. I also want to acknowledge that social enterprise in itself is not a new thing, and Maori business has been around in New Zealand for a long time, and a lot of Maori and Pacifica owned businesses have a very long time frame on success and a very broad time frame on the outcomes that are being driven. And there is a really strong alignment, you know, in terms of an impact-led organisation. And an example of that, who we work with, is Maui Studios that do design and media and communications work. So there's a lot of these organisations around as well. So that's a taste of the kinds of suppliers, and I'll talk more about some of the other ways of doing this. But first of all, let's have a look at what's going on in New Zealand. So there is a lot of action in New Zealand, and it's going one direction, and it's more and more a topic of discussion. Is really, given how much money is spent in Aotearoa every year, you know, every day effectively, how do we harness that spend to benefit and drive outcomes that we're trying to see? And it's really, it's probably not a stretch to say it is a really massive untapped opportunity to create positive impact just by the expenditure that's going on anyway. And that's really what social procurement's about. And obviously those numbers have changed a bit in recent times. Like the government spend is no longer around 50 billion. There's obviously a lot more going in. And we've had a lot of conversations around shovel-ready projects and community impact and the Provincial Growth Fund and all these types of initiatives. And it's really coming back to what are we trying to achieve with that expenditure. And that's where our work is as an intermediary, and we've also got an equivalent in Hiwaki Kinoa, who's a partner of ours who work with Maori and Pacifica businesses. And there's a whole lot of activity, but the one that really jumps out as a highlight over the last 12 months is the change of the government procurement rules. And as an example of the way the conversation has unfolded, really, what's happened with the government procurement rules is is there's a big chunk that's appeared in the middle in terms of what they define as public value. And you've got good quality and good price, which is an absolute essential part of procurement. But good outcomes has been added into that conversation, and the government has now mandated that for all agencies in every purchasing decision, that they must consider these broader outcomes. And broader outcomes impact, same language again, just different terms. But really that sets the benchmark for, you know, the way a lot of procurement's done in New Zealand and the way a lot of projects will be commissioned. And you'll see this more and more if you are, you know, tendering for work and things like that, and also see it coming through the funding lines, etc., from government. But essentially what they're trying to drive is these economic, environmental, social and cultural outcomes again. So it's really about just, you know, putting some definition around what they're looking for. The other thing is that there's a lot of movement from, you know, both public sector and private sector organisations, and this is a list of the organisations that we're working with. And the motivations are always slightly different, but, you know, for some organisations, there's an expectation if you're a government organisation and you're a local government organisation, you're there to look after your community or your region or the country or whatever the mandate is. But increasingly, as I said, you've got motivated private organisations who are looking at their supply chains and saying, well, what's the opportunity here? What about the spend that we're making? But also, where have we got problems that we need to address? And one of those organisations we've worked with is New Zealand Post, and they're recognising their connection with the community across New Zealand and the fact that they're being challenged by having to, you know, move back on postal services because it doesn't make money, and all those real world challenges that these organisations have. They're looking at their expenditure and saying, well, what's the opportunity to do things a little bit differently? The regional conversation is really interesting. Buy local's been a real rallying cry, and I'm sure everyone's heard it a lot in recent times. And obviously local has, you know, immense potential benefits from an economic perspective, where if you spend locally, then those people will spend locally, etc., and that money go round starts to happen. But there's also a greater opportunity in terms of social and environmental impact, and the positive impacts is that if you're spending with that in mind, you not only get the economic value, but you could get returns kind of estimated between $4 and $8 for every dollar invested in terms of social outcomes and environmental outcomes over and above the circulation of money. So that becomes a very compelling thing to explore. And the reality is every purchase that we make has an impact, whether it's intended or not. And really social procurement is, as I said, is about trying to drive the most positive impact and to do it intentionally and strategically. Taranaki has a big push in this space as well. And again, if you look at Te Paeroa, then you see social, environmental, cultural, economic. You see these outcomes of talented people, you know, an attractive lifestyle, you know, enterprise, participation in the economy, low emissions, all those types of things. So again, as a region, Taranaki's no different to most of the regions around New Zealand, and imagining what they want, you know, what the region wants as outcomes and as a place to live and for the people and the environment. The other thing is that this is a global thing. This isn't just a textbook thing that's going on in little places. This is actually happening all over the world, and the two examples I've got here are partners of ours in Australia and Canada who have the same conversations around the same things, and there's a lot of movement going on, and the scale of it is increasing. And while the context of all the different countries and jurisdictions is slightly different, it makes it really great in terms of sharing practice and seeing what's possible. You know, a great example of Canada is they have what's called community benefit agreements, where no major project can be started without a community benefit agreement in place. And that's an agreement between whoever the party is building the project and the local community about what, you know, how's it going to be built and what are the long-term impacts and outcomes that can be achieved. The other thing is the regional precedent, and this is really exciting in terms of some of the work that's going on The Coastal Communities Initiative here is 21 local government agencies around Vancouver collaborating on procurement and social procurement. Grow is an initiative in Geelong, west of Melbourne, and that came out of basically 3 large employers closing their doors within 12 to 18 months of each other, and thousands of jobs being lost instantaneously, and a realization that a lot of the spend that is made locally in Geelong was actually going down the road to Melbourne. And what's been the outcome is that over 3 years they've increased their local expenditure by $20 million per annum, and most people are spending and employing locally now. The two councils shown here are UK councils, obviously Manchester and Preston, and they've really taken this view of using procurement as a tool to better the areas. And some of the changes, Preston has increased its retention of procurement spend by key institutions. They use this term anchor institutions, your council, your government departments, a university, those types of organisations. Just those alone is a massive amount of spend, but they've increased their retention by 200% in 8 years. So they've really flipped the fact that most of the money went out the door into other areas in other regions, and really invested into the local outcomes. And Manchester was the same, and Manchester itself has in about 10 years has increased its local spend by 25%, and over half of its spend is with SMEs now. So these things are possible, and the outcomes of jobs for marginalised people, apprenticeships, volunteering initiatives, all those types of things are the things that are driven through this type of regional approach. So just having a look at social procurement and just diving into it a little bit here. First of all, I'll use the terms buyers and suppliers, but effectively in its simplest form, you have organisations that buy things and you have people that supply things, and then those suppliers buy things. So you end up with this concept of a supply chain, and it's a really good thing to acknowledge that there is a whole cascade of organisations that exist in supply chains. And I think the interesting thing about what's happened recently in New Zealand and COVID and the shutdown of supply chains is that I don't think a lot of people realised what sat behind the organisation they usually bought from, and where the stuff, whether it's the components or the parts of things, where they all came from. So that's it's both a challenge and an opportunity for social procurement to look at a supply chain and look at how where do these opportunities exist to deliver impact. And it might not be at the first layer, it might be further down the chain, especially when you're looking at smaller organisations and where they participate. The other drivers that are really common for doing this are around keeping money in local economies, and employment's another massive driver, and obviously a very topical driver, but not just jobs, starting to actually direct employment for people who are normally marginalised out of employment, and that's whether they're long-term unemployed or particular groups of people in certain circumstances and all those types of things. So employment is obviously a massive driver for social procurement. There's this concept of economic empowerment, again, so giving people the opportunity to create better outcomes by being involved in business activities and owning businesses and using them as vehicles for good, and the environmental footprint conversation as well. And what that means is that there's lots of different ways of doing this, and this is where procurement becomes a really interesting driver. You can do things yourself as an organisation, and then you can do it through the expenditure. And some of the examples that are here are, using local businesses, or using social enterprises, or using Maori and Pacifica owned businesses. And these are all, effectively they just become the types of suppliers that you might want to consider putting into your supply chain to generate impact. But also equally, you've got a whole lot of existing organisations who can do good as well. And it's about encouraging people to think about this. So yeah, again, I put this in here to remind us again of the outcomes for Taranaki, and that there are a series of these, and there's employment in there, and there's local investment and enterprise and participation, and so those concepts are very much in line with those drivers. So what are the benefits of doing this? I guess it depends on who you are as an organisation, and for a for a local government entity or a private sector organisation or a contractor or whatever, there's lots of different, there'll be different things that resonate with you. But broadly speaking, here's a bit of a list of some of the benefits. First of all, brand and reputation. A lot of people are looking to be the place where people want to go and work, and also you want your workforce to be motivated. And really, social procurement is an opportunity to walk the talk of your brand, and to demonstrate to the people that work with you or for you or buy from you that you are there and you're doing what you say you're doing, or you're meeting their expectations. There's a competitive advantage to this, and I don't think this has been really realised yet in New Zealand. There's certainly evidence, real stories out of the likes of Australia, where when people proactively step into this and say, look, this is what we're really committed to, we really want to do this, and even go to the extent of setting targets on spend and things like that voluntarily without being asked to, and it can be a real point of competitive advantage and difference, because increasingly people are wanting to see it, and you may actually be ahead of the curve. But really, this is about, if you work and provide products or services for someone, you want to be delivering the most value you can. So you've got a great opportunity here. There's the leadership play here, and this really resonates, I think, with government entities, is that if you want to demonstrate that you do what you're encouraging everyone else to do, you can be a real leader in your sector or a region and make a difference. And that really, I think a lot of people who work in social procurement and procurement professionals, get a lot of value out of just being part of something that's bigger than them and being making a contribution. The other thing that's not to be ignored here is this innovation opportunity and risk mitigation. And there's a lot of talk, for example, in areas like construction, where people say we just can't find people anymore. Like there's no talent, we're not getting people coming in, not getting people staying in the sector. If you start to invest into this stuff, you're actually directly addressing those issues. And also, you would have seen from that example with Duffel & Co, you've got these organisations who are just hell-bent on innovation and not kind of accepting that, that, for example, they do, corporate goods and merchandise. They're not just accepting buying something off the shelf from somewhere. They're looking at opportunities to do things differently. And also, there are problems that aren't solved. And a great example of that is for some of our waste challenges that we have in New Zealand. And there's these market opportunities that are sitting there with organisations ready to go and step in and actually start solving these problems. The last is around connection and relationships. And there's a massive push in procurement to build and also recognition that good supplier relationships are really intrinsic to doing procurement well and to having a good supply chain. And these have been really tested recently. And it's how do you move beyond transactional relationships where I buy something and you're the supplier and that's that. There's opportunities to create greater efficiencies, and also social procurement offers an opportunity to start to bridge across the public sector and the private sector, and no, that's a government thing, and no, that's our thing over here, and we're this sector and you're that sector, and start to have a collective conversation about these positive outcomes that you're looking to see. And also, straight up, if you can generate good social and environmental outcomes, we're actually delivering efficiencies for government and for our region, and no longer just assuming that someone's going to come in and tidy things up. But underneath all of this, it is just the right thing to do. there's an ethical driver here to all of this. So just to pick up a Taranaki example with New Plymouth District Council, New Plymouth District Council has done some amazing work transforming its supplier relationships, and really the drivers started out of health and safety and people, and looking at opportunities to just do things smarter and better. And particularly in the roading programs, there's been some really amazing outcomes from an environmental perspective, from a safety perspective, from a workforce perspective. And just to quote David Langford, the infrastructure manager there, he describes it as moving from being a bad client, you know, where there was very much a master-servant type relationship in supply chain, to you know, delivering meaningful outcomes and saving money. So if you actually step into this, it's a really interesting opportunity, and they're a great example of thinking beyond the actual transaction that's sitting in front of them as well. And a great example of that was the electrification of their waste vehicles. And they recognize that if we're going to ask our supplier to electrify their fleet, we're going to need someone to look after that fleet. So they went out into the business community and found, you know, a local a firm to step into maintaining electric vehicles. So you start thinking about the future of work and the transition to a different kind of economy. And these are all great examples. So yeah, it's phenomenal work that they've been doing, and a great example of that cross-functional, you know, across different outcomes. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend this is all easy. It's very easy for me to sit here and say it's so great, you get all these benefits and all that kind of stuff. But I'm a realist too, and just to pick up on some of the real common challenges that we see in the work that we're doing with, you know, with buyers and suppliers. The first one is this perception. As soon as you start talking about concepts like sustainability and people go, oh, green and da-da-da-da, the immediate thoughts are usually, this is going to cost us more, and it's going to be harder, and we're going to have to think about all these things. We're just trying to do the day-to-day, and, you know, and particularly in this environment where, you know, the economic pressures are there as well. It's very easy to just go, it's going to cost us more and it's going to be harder. And the suppliers that, you know, if I talked about social enterprises or organizations bumped into social enterprises, the first perception is, oh, what are they here for? They're a charity, you know, they won't do a good job. That's all, to be honest, a load of tosh, to be honest. And we've seen that it doesn't have to cost more money. And I'd like to just say that this isn't about doing this at all costs and paying twice as much for something. It's about balancing up what value you're getting from a transaction. And a lot of the time, the reality of all of this is it's just not part of the discussion that people are having. And as soon as you start talking about employment or environmental outcomes, then you'll find that there's people who have got similarly aligned aspirations. The other things that we see are there's been a massive push in procurement to consolidate and, you know, use the one-stop shop to do everything. And you see things like facilities management, where we deal with one supplier and they do all our cleaning and security and maintenance and all that kind of stuff, and you just leave them to support out work out the rest of how it's going to work. So yes, when you start adding more suppliers, you are adding more conversations and more relationships and more transactions, but there's a value that comes with that as well. And it also starts to de-risk your supply chain because you can actually see everything in front of you, so you're not just assuming. The point here around trying too much is that we see really engaged people step into social procurement and just try and do everything all at once. Not a great approach. You do need to resource it. You do need to think about it, and you do need to make some space. Organisations that just throw it in to day and hope that it's going to happen is not a great approach, because quite often the environment is fast paced and you're thinking about what's coming next. So, you know, committing to it and being realistic about where you spend money, etc., and where the real opportunities are is a really good approach. There's a supply demand gap, you know, like I've talked about some kinds of suppliers, different kinds of suppliers that we've got out there. If everyone turned around and said, right, we're ready to go on social procurement, where is all this stuff? You know, the reality is some of those markets are not there yet. But equally, if you start providing opportunities for people to provide you goods and services, then you'll see new entities step forward and new entities be formed, and that's what we're seeing. But underneath all of this is just a push to, you know, give this a go, really. take some steps. The organisations that we've seen make the biggest strides in this started somewhere and did something, you know, and just took their first steps. So, you know, be practical and make the good decisions on what those first steps are. But this needs change, and people can either use change as an excuse to do nothing, or they can actually say, do you know what, you know, we can make this happen, or we can try something different here, and you won't be disappointed. The point around value, just to loop back on that, value for money is a procurement thing that people love to talk about, and it's quite often, you know, value for money / price. Now, price is not the sole determinant of everything, and I think anyone who's worked on just chasing the lowest price on something realizes at some point something comes a cropper, and really the principles of what we're talking about in social procurement is just good procurement. Know who your supply market is. Start conversations with them early. Build good relationships. Think openly about the problem you're trying to solve, not just run the same process again. You know, that kind of thing. And just to reinforce, it's not about compromise. I'm not saying forget about price or risk or quality or what you're getting. It's all got to be on the table. And it's really just about thinking about what other value can be generated. So there's a move on both sides. We've got to move the buyers and we've got to move the suppliers. Both need to change. So just quickly, mindful of time as well. You know, for buyers, my kind of key points of advice are, first of all, what are you trying to achieve? Like, what are your priorities? And that's going to depend on who you are as an organization, what's important to you, but also potentially what your clients are talking about, and being, you know, just listening and saying, oh, well, actually, we can do something in the employment space or in the environment space or whatever. Having a look at where you spend money and looking for real opportunities. There's lots of things that are just simply not on the table. We've had conversations with the likes of district health boards, and you know, like they can't change where their PPE comes from, really. It's like, you know, there's certain things you can't change, but there's lots of things you can. And uncovering where these other suppliers are, these innovative suppliers, and as I said, take some action and also think about the impact that you're generating, and don't lose that through this. And if you're a supplier who's in this space, and I'm not too sure who we've got on the call, but you know, like even for a large business who's, you know, doing work for someone, you know, build these relationships with your buyers. That's just good sense, but it helps you understand what the drivers are and where they're trying to go with this. You need to be good at what you do. You need to do the bread and butter. The products and services have got to be right. But the authenticity piece comes in, and it's like, you know, you've got to walk the talk about what you do and show that you're doing it too. And also tell the story about the impact that you're generating really clearly, because if people are buying in a social procurement way, then impact's part of that transaction. So if it's not talked about, then it's not going to be, you know, very clear. So hopefully that's, yeah, there's very much, this is a journey. So, you know, like, take the steps, be realistic, do some stuff, you know, take action and learn from it. That's a really good thing. And just think about how you can help people step into this conversation. If you are working with suppliers, there's so much you can do. You know, there's a good example is that you can say, we expect you to meet XYZ health and safety standards, tick the box, yes or no, or you can actually engage with them and tell them what you're looking for and help them meet that. So you just don't know what you're shutting the door on sometimes in procurement. Targets drive behavior. You know, set some benchmarks and set some change, whether that's internal, and tell the stories about what's going on. And you know, the Plymouth story is a really fantastic story, for example, and that's the stuff that resonates. So yeah, and just quickly, you know, what we do, which shows the moving pieces is, you know, we work with buyers to help people untangle this and work out how to implement it into their organizations. And I mentioned our social enterprise suppliers, and we've got a certification for those types of suppliers. But equally, you can substitute social enterprise and Māori and Pacifica business and these other innovative suppliers. But really, in in its essence, what you're trying to do is bring buyers and suppliers together. This is the heart of social procurement, to create that impact and look for those opportunities to trade, and that's really what it's about. So yeah, that's me. So I'll throw it back to Stephanie and Seán.
Thank you so much, Seán. That's amazing. We'll just open up to some questions, so please keep them coming in. So far we've got, you talk a lot about social enterprise. To do social procurement, does this have to be through a social enterprise? No,
not at all. So a social enterprise is an example of a supplier that when you purchase from them, you'll generate impact. And the same applies to a Māori and Pacifica enterprise as well, generally. And so you can try different kinds of suppliers. So that's the direct purchase. So you can change the way who you buy from directly, or indirectly, you can start working with your existing suppliers and encourage people to look down the supply chain, or encourage them to do things differently. So there's kind of two different approaches. You can, I'll probably just give an example. So if you were looking, for example, if there was a normal business and a Maori business that provided the same things for the same price, you can make the conscious decision about which one you buy from, or you provide an opportunity for both entities to pitch for you. And that's a direct approach. You might work with a large company that does all your facilities management, and you might say to them, hey, we really value employment outcomes. What can you do directly, or what can you do in your supply chain? So there's lots of different angles on this, but ultimately what you're trying to do is bring impact into that procurement conversation. That's what social procurement's about.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you. So that probably leads into the second question, that's around how do you actually initiate them first conversations in this space? Oh,
internally or with the suppliers? I think I'll cover both because it's kind of interesting. We've seen the kind of light bulbs go on inside organizations, and that either comes from hearing it from people who are asking for it. So if you're tendering, I'll be very surprised that if you're doing anything with government that you're not bumping into this already. So there's potentially light bulb moments there, but there's also people who are motivated and start this conversation, whether that's in procurement or somewhere else in the organization or at a CEO level. So there's something that usually triggers the conversation inside an organization, and then it's about implementation, and then it's about building some momentum and starting to step into this. And that's the bit that's really hard. It's very easy to for a city councillor to say we really care about these outcomes, and then say off you go, council, go and do it. That's a little bit tricky. That's the hard part, really. But in terms of starting conversations with suppliers, I mean, we connect people with different kinds of suppliers. There are other organisations out there. Venture Taranaki is another organisation that probably has a whole connection and a whole range of organisations that people may have never even thought about or know about. And really, what you need to do there is just to start thinking about that procurement is not just drop a tender out the door and hope everyone comes running, because there's so many organisations who don't even know where tenders come out. So you don't even know half the time what you're missing, I think. So right. You need to do things a bit differently.
Thank you. So we have another question. How do you weight social procurement as part of your criteria? What range of weightings have you observed, and what specific aspects do you look for that help differentiate between suppliers?
Such a good question. there's a lot in that. I'll unpack that first bit by bit. I talked about being clear about what outcomes you're trying to achieve. That's a really important conversation, because if you don't have that conversation, then you get into the middle of something and you realize that everyone has different expectations. That's so you've got to start that conversation and say, okay, if this is about employment, what does good look like? What are we actually trying to achieve here? That's really important. Then when you get into a procurement process, and the reference to weightings is, how do you make decisions? What is your evaluation process in procurement? And what we're starting to see is I don't know, the 10, 20% potentially going to sustainability or these types of outcomes. It's certainly not 100% or anything like that. There's still lots of tenders that go out with price at 80 or 90%, and you know, that's a pretty clear message on what's important there. But that kind of weighting is starting to be reasonably common. But there's a difference between saying we care about sustainability and it's 10% of our decision, off you go, tell me what you do, and anyone who's worked in the space will say that you get, oh, we changed the light bulbs, we recycle paper. You're not getting what you asked for. So so being specific and knowing, being clear helps that. But when you're doing these weightings, have a think about what good looks like and what does an evaluation process look like, so that you when you come to scoring things, you're not just in the moment making stuff up. And what starts to happen is people give the highest marks to the longest answer to a sustainability question in a tender, which is not really what this is about. So it pays to just stop and think about what does that look like and what how are we going to peg the scores. So case studies, that's I'm presuming I'm seeing what you're seeing. So yeah, so we're starting to get New Zealand case studies now, and you know, the things that jump up are, you know, Auckland Council's done a lot of amazing work with Māori and Pacifica business. If you had a look at Central Rail Link as a massive project that's going on in Auckland, this is very much front and centre. And I spoke about New Plymouth district, and some of the government agencies are really stepping into this. The likes of Kaingaora Housing, ex-Housing New Zealand Transport Agency is doing a lot of work behind the scenes, and there's a lot of we're starting to see Auckland Transport's just released their sustainable procurement website that's got some case studies on it as well. So we're just starting to see these come out in New Zealand now, which is really great. You know, 12 months, 18 months ago, we're talking about a lot of what was going on in Australia, but this is good now. We've got the New Zealand the New Zealand story is starting to emerge, and also increasingly people are working together and starting to define the practice in New Zealand and how does this actually work. So yeah, it's all very emergent. Yes.
Right. Okay, so we've probably got time for just a couple more questions. So another one is, bearing in mind the global pressures currently impacting the supply chains, and many suppliers are struggling, is social procurement something that should be put on hold until business continuity is more assured?
Yeah, well, I mean, business continuity is obviously a huge, you know, if you've got things that you need and you need to get them, no matter what way you need to get them, you need them, you know, like obviously that's a priority. But I guess the questions then come, you know, if you are dependent on global supply chains, you know, there's a really interesting question about what can we do locally in that respect, and are there local suppliers that might actually give you a better surety of supply and some more local benefits and things like that. So it's a very interesting conversation. It's not a throw it all out and don't consider it because it's too hard. I think there are opportunities to explore. So you never know who's out there, and we saw that, you know, with supply chains that got disrupted, and all of a sudden there's a whole lot of New Zealand businesses, you know, stepping in and making PPE and all that kind of stuff, whereas, you know, you could have just gone, oh well, yeah, the supply chains is broken. Yeah, so I would challenge people to have a think about that. You know, like it's not, I certainly not oh well, this sounds a bit complex, let's just leave it. I think it's moving and it's happening in New Zealand. So yeah, you're going to bump into it at some point, and it's worth considering.
That really leads us on to the last question. You spoke around understanding your own internal priorities when you look at your own social procurement, but is there something that you are seeing as a trend as far as a wider priority for New Zealand?
Oh, totally. Well, I mean, the government procurement rules really set that, you know, and I don't think I realised how influential, you know, the way government does procurement is on the way people do procurement, and also the knock-on effects. And I think, you know, the recent the recent discussions that have been in the construction sector as an example, there's a realization that from the construction sector as a whole and all the entities that participate in it, that the way things were being done previously isn't ideal. You've still got, labour struggles, health and safety challenges, low margins and profitability and all that type of stuff. And that was inherent in the industry, before any of this happened. And so we've got this great opportunity to stop and reevaluate what's important and actually think about, how, procurement's a huge part of that, and the buyers and suppliers and the interrelationships. So, so I think absolutely, you've got to be clear as an organisation about what your priorities are. That's a fundamental. And these things are becoming more and more important to people. So I don't think it's going away is probably the best way to describe it. So, yeah.
Nice. Well, that's a nice note to leave on. Thanks so much, Seán, for the information pack on social procurement and doing the right thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And thank you all that attended. We'll make sure to send out the recording. And next week, we're also releasing some guidelines that Seán has helped us with. So stay tuned for those. Other than that, have a lovely Thursday evening and haere rā.